Okay, so in general, what we're trying to do here is the assumption is we have a certain education that's been consciously jerry rigged, as it were, or jiggered, as it were. So, in order, for instance, the education right now, 2020, is different than education 2010. In the seventh grade and fifth grade and preschool, etc. So go back to 1970, go back to 1960, go back to 1950, go back to 1960. There's always conscious interventions on what our education will be, and this, to some extent, determines how we think. So that if we're very naive, then and especially when we're younger, we all do it, is we consider thoughts that we have to be original, which are actually can easily be shown to be the product of our education. And then we can go, if we look into the history of education, we can see when they came in, and that somebody consciously had an idea and said we should change our curriculum and incorporate these new ideas. So we have basically a rigorous, strong form of censorship, which leads to a certain form of education. And eventually, say around the year 1900, this becomes more and more promulgated that we would have this so-called idealized hypothetical subject of the scientific experiment. Though I was just trying to go into a little bit of what that's like. And that subject is the subject which cuts off experience in the normal sense that all of us have experience of our life, which is unrepeatable and which is our own experience, and we learn certain things which may be communicable to others, but they can't be presented as perfect knowledge because they don't fit in with some kind of thing like a ruler with inches, where we can present that as objective knowledge and then say this would be as though we were dead. We don't need to undergo any further experiments. This is the limit on experience, as though we already were dead and can look back at the object of our life and say this is the right measure of it. So this subject, the scientific subject, what I'm trying to do is, just as we can compare the education as it were in 1850 to the education as it were in 2020, and then potentially learn something from the juxtaposition, we can, in the same way, we can compare Agamemnon as something like just as we could understand Christ not in this way, the Rene Girard Christ, but Christ is as a figure that stands in for human suffering in toto. So Christ on the cross just stands in for that all of us in our individual life are nailed to the cross in some sense. In the same way, Agamemnon, who has to learn through his experience, has to undergo experience, has to undergo guilt, be exposed to shame, guilt, to humiliation, to everything a human being has to be exposed to, and then possibly to learn. We have again this specific way of understanding the man as man under Plato and Socrates. We have this in the figure of Christ, which could then be juxtaposed to Zoroaster, to potentially to Moses, to other figures which could stand for man as man, or stand as the archetype of man. And then we have this figure, which is the most powerful currently, which is the hypothetical scientific subject, which seems to be a kind of a hollowed out subject, which is presented as though it were no one. Right, that's one of the characteristics of it. It's presented as though it had no personality, as though it were simply this dead figure that accrues to it knowledge. The way that's done is by pretending that the objective knowledge has nothing to do with the actual scientists who are the subjects, who then carry out the measurements in rigorous fashion. So the subjective knowledge and the objective knowledge are actually totally connected, because there always has to be a subject, an individual scientist who carries out any experience, but then they can say we're adding to the accumulating asymptotic knowledge base of the sciences, and therefore pass themselves off as neutral or as objective. So why is it passed off as neutral? It's because what's ignored here is that a specific choice has been made to take this path of the scientific, the idealized hypothetical subject in contradistinction to these other ways of thinking about the human being and about the ongoing experience of the human being, which is still capable of learning and which isn't to be declared, as it were, dead through the method of framing only certain subject matter as the measurement in inches or with a ruler, and saying this is the real knowledge and this is the things that we don't need to continue to undergo experience with, except in this sense that we can repeat the sought out experiences, which we call experiment. The sought out experiences, which we call experiment, which we can repeat, is a form of, as it were, cherry picking the experience which counts as experience. Only the experiment counts as real experience. The experience of every human being, the unrepeatable experience of every human being, lies outside of those specific measures, to the extent that it lies outside those specific measures. We all may have experience of measuring things with a ruler. Some of us do, some of us don't. How we consider that, how much weight we put on those results would differ from person to person, and all kinds of considerations come in, but that's not the main thrust of what it's trying to at least put forward as is something that can stimulate thought.